Imagine a standard American military pistol. It is sitting in the mud, half buried under the decaying leaves of a jungle floor. The metal is beginning to pit, the bluing is scratched away, and the magazine is empty. To the retreating army that left it behind, this object is a failure. It is debris. It represents a lost position, a frantic evacuation, a surrender. It is a piece of industrial mass production that has served its purpose and been discarded in the face of an overwhelming enemy advance. But now, shift your perspective. Look at that same rusting pistol through the eyes of a desperate man hiding in the undergrowth, a man whose country has been occupied, whose army has dissolved, and whose only option is to fight or die. To him, that piece of metal isn't debris. It is the Holy Grail. It is a lifeline. It is the difference between being a victim and being a soldier. This is the story of the M1911 in the Pacific Theater. We often talk about World War II in terms of massive fleet movements, aerial dogfights, and tank battles. We obsess over the atomic bomb or the M1 Garand. But in the shadows of the Philippines, in the dense foliage of the archipelagos, a different war was being fought. It was a war where supply lines didn't exist, where reinforcements were never coming, and where a heavy, kicking, 7-round handgun designed for cavalrymen became the most feared instrument of the resistance. How did a weapon designed for the front lines transform into a tool of assassination and ambush? How did farmers and stranded soldiers keep these complex machines running without oil, spare parts, or factory ammunition? This is the anatomy of desperation. This is how a discarded American relic became the guerrilla's deadly weapon. To understand the resurrection of this weapon, we must first understand its death. The early months of the war in the Pacific, specifically late 1941 and early 1942, were defined by catastrophe for the Allied forces. The Japanese war machine moved with a speed and ferocity that the colonial powers were unprepared for. In the Philippines, the American and Filipino forces were pushed back, mile by bloody mile, down the Bataan Peninsula. The M1911 and its A1 variant was the standard-issue sidearm of the United States forces. It was a hefty, slab-sided semi-automatic pistol chambered for the massive .45 ACP cartridge. It was a weapon born from the lessons of the Philippine-American War decades earlier, designed specifically to have enough stopping power to drop a charging adversary in their tracks. By 1941, hundreds of thousands of them were in circulation. Officers carried them. Machine gun crews carried them. Tankers, pilots, and military police carried them. However, in the hierarchy of warfare, the pistol is usually an afterthought. It is a badge of rank or a weapon of last resort. You do not win wars with pistols. You win them with artillery, rifles, and air power. As the American defenses collapsed in Bataan and Corregidor, the priority was survival, not inventory management. When the surrender orders came, chaos ensued. Soldiers were ordered to destroy their heavy weapons to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Bolts were thrown into the jungle. Breech blocks were smashed. But personal sidearms were different. In the confusion of the Bataan Death March and the chaotic dissolution of units, thousands of these pistols were simply tossed aside. Some were buried in shallow holes wrapped in oilcloth by soldiers hoping to return. Others were dropped in rice paddies. Many were taken from the bodies of the fallen by Japanese soldiers, only to be discarded later as they ran out of the specific American ammunition. By mid-1942, the jungle was littered with the steel skeletons of the American presence. The M1911 was officially obsolete in this theater, a weapon with no army to wield it. The Japanese Imperial Army held the cities, the roads, and the airfields. The concept of organized American resistance was, on paper, finished. The pistol should have rusted away, returning to the earth as iron oxide. But the war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The front line had dissolved, meaning the front line was now everywhere. And in a war without lines, a weapon you can hide under a shirt becomes more valuable than a howitzer you have to tow with a truck. The acquisition of these weapons marks the beginning of the guerrilla movement in the Pacific. We must look at the psychological state of the resistance fighters. These were a mix of refusal to surrender American troops, Filipino soldiers, and local farmers who formed groups like the Hukbalahap. Initially, they fought with bolos, machetes, and sharpened bamboo. To attack a Japanese patrol with a blade requires a level of courage that borders on suicide. You have to get within arm's reach of a man with a rifle. The recovery of the M1911s changed the geometric logic of the ambush. It extended the killing zone from 3 feet to 20 yards. The scavenging process was fraught with extreme danger. Guerrillas would crawl through former battlefields at night, sifting through the mud and rotting equipment of the previous months. They were looking for the distinctive shape of the Colt slide. Finding one was a moment of euphoria, but it was often short-lived. A pistol found in a swamp after 3 months is not a functioning weapon. It is a seized block of rust. This is where the narrative shifts from military history to a story of sheer human will. These fighters didn't just pick up guns. They had to resurrect them. They dismantled these seized weapons using nails and rocks as tools. They soaked the parts in coconut oil or kerosene to loosen the rust. They used sand to scrub the pitting from the slide rails. The acquisition of the M1911 was also a matter of opportunistic violence. As the resistance grew, the primary source of weapons shifted from scavenging the dead to ambushing the living. A lone Japanese sentry might be carrying a captured M1911 as a trophy. Killing that sentry meant retrieving the weapon. It became a cyclical economy of violence. Use a knife to get a pistol. Use the pistol to get a rifle. Use the rifle to get a crate of ammo. But the M1911 held a special place in this hierarchy. It was a symbol. The rifle was a soldier's tool, hard to hide and heavy to carry. The M1911 was an officer's weapon, a symbol of authority. For a guerrilla leader in the mountains of Luzon or Mindanao, wearing a .45 on their hip was a statement. It said that American power was not gone. It was merely sleeping, waiting to strike. It provided a psychological anchor for the resistance. When a fighter pulled out that heavy slab of American steel, it reminded everyone what they were fighting for and who their allies were, even if those allies were thousands of miles away. Once the weapons were acquired, the real challenge began, keeping them functional in a hostile environment with zero logistical support. The M1911 is a robust machine. John Browning designed it with loose tolerances specifically to handle dirt and grit, but even it has limits. The first problem was the springs. After months of neglect or years of use, recoil springs would snap or lose their tension. You cannot order a replacement spring from a factory when you are hiding in a jungle canopy. Guerrilla armorers, often local blacksmiths or mechanics who had never worked on guns before, had to improvise. They cannibalized springs from machinery, typewriters, or vehicle suspensions, winding the metal by hand and heat-treating it in charcoal fires to get the temper right. If the spring was too stiff, the gun wouldn't cycle. If it was too soft, the slide would batter the frame to pieces. They had to find the perfect balance by feel and trial alone. Then there were the grips. The original checkered walnut or plastic grips would rot or crack in the humidity. Guerrillas replaced them with whatever was at hand. We see historical examples of M1911s fitted with grips carved from water buffalo horn, mahogany, or even aluminum salvaged from downed aircraft. These modifications weren't just cosmetic. They were necessary to keep the internal magazine release and mainspring housing protected. The most desperate, and perhaps most ingenious modification involved ammunition. A gun without bullets is just a hammer. As the war dragged on, the stockpiles of .45 ACP ammo dried up. The resistance had to manufacture their own. This was a process fraught with the risk of blowing off one's own hand. They would scavenge spent brass casings from skirmish sites. They had to resize the brass, often by forcing it through a hole drilled in a steel plate. For primers, the spark that ignites the powder, they would carefully scrape the tips of hundreds of match heads, mixing the chemical paste and pressing it into the base of the casing. For propellant, they used whatever gunpowder they could salvage from, unexploded ordnance, artillery shells, or Japanese rifle rounds, grinding it down to change the burn rate. The projectiles themselves were often cast from melted down lead pipes or wheel weights, poured into crude molds made of clay or wood. These hand-loaded rounds were inconsistent, smoky, and dirty. They often jammed. But at close range, they worked. We also saw the modification of the weapon's profile. Guerrillas needed to move among the civilian population undetected. The M1911 is a large handgun. Files were taken to the sites to snag-proof them. Hammers were bobbed, cut short, so they wouldn't catch on clothing during a draw from a concealed waistband. In some rare documented instances, crude suppressors were fashioned from bamboo or metal piping packed with steel wool and leather washers. These didn't silence the gun like a movie spy weapon, but they muffled the distinct booming report of the .45, confusing the enemy about the direction and distance of the shot. The modifications dictated the tactics. A guerrilla with a reconditioned M1911 and 5 rounds of handmade ammunition does not fight a pitched battle. He does not engage at 50 yards. He fights in the phone booth range, point blank. The jungle environment of the Pacific was claustrophobic. Visibility could be limited to 5 or 10 feet. In this terrain, the long bolt-action rifles of the Japanese infantry were clumsy. If a patrol was ambushed on a narrow trail, the soldier with the rifle had to traverse his weapon, aim, and cycle the bolt. The guerrilla with the M1911 simply had to point and squeeze. The tactics developed were predatory. One common method was the spider hole ambush. A fighter would bury himself in a camouflaged pit along a supply route, sometimes waiting for hours or days. When a Japanese officer or courier passed, the guerrilla would emerge, fire 2 or 3 rapid shots at close range, snatch any intelligence or weapons, and vanish back into the green wall of the jungle before the escort could react. The M1911's semi-automatic capability allowed for multiple targets to be engaged in split seconds, a massive advantage over bolt-action rifles or swords. The stopping power of the .45 caliber round was also a significant tactical factor. Guerrilla warfare is psychological. The goal is not just to kill the enemy, but to terrify them. The .45 ACP is a slow, heavy bullet. It hits with the force of a sledgehammer. Reports from the time detail how Japanese soldiers feared the hand cannons of the resistance. A hit in the shoulder or leg would often take a man completely out of the fight, knocking him backward. This created a mythos around the weapon. Japanese patrols became more hesitant to enter deep jungle areas, fearing that every shadow held a man with a .45. Another tactical innovation was the feigned surrender. A guerrilla, seemingly unarmed, would approach a checkpoint or a group of soldiers with hands raised, tucked into the small of their back or hidden inside a basket of fruit, was the M1911, cocked and locked. Once inside the perimeter, The transition from submissive civilian to lethal combatant happened in the blink of an eye. These were desperate, dirty tactics, violating the conventions of traditional warfare, but the guerrillas argued that the occupation itself was a violation. The M1911 was the tool that leveled the playing field between the oppressed and the occupier. Reliability was key here. Even with the crude modifications, the loose rattling fit of the M1911 meant it could function when full of mud. In a sudden tropical downpour, where other weapons might jam, the American pistol would usually fire. That reliability gave the guerrillas the confidence to execute these high-risk maneuvers. As the war turned and the American forces eventually returned to liberate the Pacific Islands, they found a strange phenomenon. They encountered ragged, emaciated guerrilla fighters emerging from the hills, carrying M1911 pistols that looked like artifacts from a bygone era. These guns were scarred, welded, fitted with strange wood, and held together with wire, yet they were still firing. The legacy of the M1901 in the Pacific is not just about the design of a firearm, it is about the resilience of the human spirit. It demonstrated that technology is only as effective as the will of the person using it. A state-of-the-art weapon in the hands of a demoralized conscript is less dangerous than a rusted, scavenged relic in the hands of a fighter defending their home. This repurposing of the M1911 created a culture of gunsmithing and improvisation that persists in the region to this day. In the Philippines, the tradition of the paltik, the ghost gun, or handmade firearm, can trace its lineage directly back to those jungle workshops of World War II. The skills learned in desperation to keep the M1901s running were passed down, creating a unique cottage industry of firearms manufacturing. Furthermore, this story serves as a case study for modern asymmetric warfare. We see the echoes of the Pacific M1911 in conflicts across the globe today. Whether it is technical vehicles in the Middle East or commercial drones repurposed for combat in Eastern Europe, the principle remains the same. The underdog will always find a way to turn the discarded, the common, or the obsolete into a deadly asset. The M1911 began its journey as a symbol of American industrial might. It ended the war as a symbol of indigenous resistance. It proved that a weapon does not define the tactic. The necessity defines the weapon. When the empire crumbled and the armies fled, leaving their steel behind in the mud, they didn't realize they were planting seeds. Those seeds were watered with oil and blood, and they grew into the instruments of their own destruction. The journey of the M1911 from a factory in Connecticut to a muddy foxhole in Mindanao is a testament to the dark ingenuity of war. It challenges our perception of what makes a weapon effective. It wasn't the polish, the rifling, or the factory specs that made these pistols deadly in the end. It was the desperation of the hands that held them. In the end, the most dangerous component of the weapon wasn't the firing pin, the slide, or the .45 caliber bullet. It was the mind of the guerrilla who looked at a piece of rusting junk and saw a way to freedom. That is the true legacy of the discarded American pistol.